What I'm about to tell you about Paul Simon was never meant to be public. A story so controversial, so revolutionary, that the music industry has spent decades trying to sanitize it. He broke cultural bans to make a masterpiece. What drove Paul Simon to risk it all? The answer is far more shocking than anyone has ever revealed. Between you and me, Paul Simon's journey to create Graceland wasn't just about music. It was about defiance, rebellion, and a secret obsession that drove him to the brink of career suicide. My industry source, who worked directly with Simon during this turbulent period, has finally broken their silence after 35 years. The truth: Paul Simon wasn't just fighting critics. He was fighting an entire world order. And the stakes were higher than anyone outside his inner circle ever knew. In 1985, when Simon boarded that plane to South Africa, he wasn't just breaking a cultural boycott. He was deliberately walking into a political minefield that could have ended everything he'd built. The UN had sanctions. Musicians worldwide had agreed not to perform there. But what they don't want you to know is, Paul Simon had already made up his mind long before anyone knew his plans. A close confidant told me that Simon had been secretly obsessing over a bootleg cassette of South African township music for months, playing it on repeat until the tape nearly wore out. This wasn't just artistic curiosity. This was an all-consuming fixation that would push him to risk everything. But that's nothing compared to what happened when he landed in Johannesburg. The recording sessions that produced Graceland. They weren't just collaborative. They were conducted in an atmosphere of paranoia and secrecy that's never been fully reported. Musicians were sneaking into studios under cover of darkness. Political activists were watching Simon's every move. And the South African government, let's just say they had their own plans for how to use a famous American artist's presence. What the tabloids don't know is that Simon received anonymous threats throughout his time in South Africa. My source revealed that on at least 3 occasions, Simon seriously considered abandoning the entire project and fleeing the country. The pressure was so intense that he developed insomnia that would plague him for years afterward. Here's where it gets truly shocking. The musicians Simon worked with in South Africa weren't just taking a professional risk. They were putting their lives on the line. My industry source revealed to me that several of them were actively being monitored by government agents. One drummer was allegedly detained and questioned for hours about his involvement with the American star. Simon knew this, and the guilt nearly crushed him. They don't want this getting out, but Simon's record label executives were in absolute panic mode when they discovered what he was doing. Internal memos I've obtained show that Columbia Records executives were preparing emergency PR strategies for what they called the Simon catastrophe. One high-level executive reportedly said, "He's committing career suicide, and he's taking us down with him." The truth finally exposed after all these years. Paul Simon wasn't just battling artistic criticism. He was fighting deep depression during this period. The isolation and backlash drove him to dark places few stars of his caliber have experienced. Between recording sessions, my source says Simon would sometimes sit alone for hours, questioning everything about his career and identity. When the album was finally completed, what they've been hiding is that Simon almost didn't release it. For 2 weeks, the master tape sat in a vault while he contemplated shelving the entire project. The album that would go on to sell 16 million copies and win Album of the Year almost never saw the light of day. But the real bombshell, the political backlash, was far worse than has ever been reported. My source, who was in the room when it happened, revealed that several prominent musicians who publicly criticized Simon were privately sending him threatening messages. One famous rock star, whose identity I'm going to protect for now, allegedly told Simon he would make sure he never worked in music again. The United Nations actually considered making a formal statement condemning Simon by name. Can you imagine? One of America's most beloved songwriters nearly being censured by the UN. The documents were drafted, I've seen copies, but ultimately shelved after intense behind-the-scenes lobbying. What drove Paul Simon to push forward despite all this? Between you and me, it wasn't just artistic integrity. My source reveals that Simon had reached a breaking point in his career before Graceland. After his previous album's disappointing performance, he was privately questioning whether he still had the creative spark that had defined his earlier work. Graceland wasn't just a musical experiment. It was his last desperate attempt to prove he was still relevant. The motivation that fueled Simon wasn't just artistic, it was existential. I either make something revolutionary, he allegedly told a close friend, or I might as well retire. Now, here's something the public has never known until today. When You Can Call Me Al started climbing the charts, Simon received a secret message from inside South Africa. Anti-apartheid activists, the very people who had criticized him most harshly, were privately using his music as inspiration in their struggle. The songs had taken on a life and meaning he never intended. My industry source revealed that during the Graceland tour, Simon was approached backstage in London by a representative of Nelson Mandela, who was still imprisoned at the time. The message: Mandela had heard the album and understood what Simon was trying to do, even if others didn't. Simon reportedly broke down in tears after this meeting. The emotional toll was devastating. What they don't want you to know is that Simon's health began deteriorating under the pressure. He lost weight, developed anxiety attacks, and according to those closest to him, aged visibly during the 18 months surrounding Graceland's release and tour. The cost of his defiance was written on his face. But that's nothing compared to what happened in Zimbabwe during the Graceland tour. When Simon performed there with Ladysmith Black Mambazo and Miriam Makeba, what the cameras didn't show was the military presence surrounding the venue. My source tells me there were legitimate concerns about possible violence or disruption. Simon performed that night knowing there were armed guards positioned throughout the crowd. The aftermath of Graceland changed everything for Paul Simon, but not in the ways most people think. Between You and Me, the album's massive success created a new kind of pressure that nearly destroyed him. After proving all his critics wrong, after creating what many consider the greatest album of his career, Simon found himself paralyzed by the question, what now? My source, who remained close to Simon in the years following Graceland, tells me he fell into a period of creative paralysis that few people know about. The man who had just revolutionized world music fusion couldn't write a single song for months. The motivation that had driven him to defy the world had evaporated once he'd proven his point. They don't want this getting out, but Simon reportedly considered walking away from music entirely after the Graceland tour ended. The emotional and physical toll had been so severe that he questioned whether any future project could be worth such a price. What the tabloids don't know is that the relationship Simon formed with the South African musicians continued long after the album's release, and not always smoothly. There were complex feelings of exploitation versus opportunity, gratitude versus resentment. My source revealed that Simon privately funded educational opportunities for several musicians' children as a way of addressing the complicated power dynamics. Here's the shocking truth about Graceland's legacy. The album didn't just revitalize Simon's career, it fundamentally changed how he saw himself. Before Graceland, he had been a songwriter who occasionally took risks. After Graceland, he became a man defined by his willingness to defy convention, even at great personal cost. This transformation wasn't easy or comfortable. Between you and me, this newfound identity created friction in his personal relationships. Friends who had known Simon for decades reported that he had changed, become more isolated, more stubborn, more willing to burn bridges. The motivation that made Graceland possible had altered him in ways that would affect every relationship in his life. But the most explosive revelation, the truth finally exposed about Paul Simon's relationship with Art Garfunkel during this period. My industry source revealed to me that Garfunkel reached out multiple times during the Graceland controversy, offering private support despite their famous falling out. Simon, however, was still harboring such deep resentment that he refused the olive branch. This rejection deepened the rift between them in ways that continue to this day. What they've been hiding all these years is that Graceland's success reopened old wounds for Simon. As the album collected Grammy awards and critical acclaim, he couldn't help but compare it to the reception of his earlier solo work that had always existed in the shadow of Simon and Garfunkel. My source tells me that Simon would sometimes mention Garfunkel during recording sessions, usually after a few drinks, wondering aloud what his former partner would think of what he was creating. The motivation driving Paul Simon wasn't just about proving critics wrong. It was about proving something to himself, to the ghost of his past partnership that still haunted him. Graceland wasn't just a new musical direction, it was an exorcism. Now, here's something no one has ever reported. During the height of the controversy, when critics were calling Simon culturally insensitive and politically naive, he privately commissioned a detailed report on where every dollar from Graceland would go. He wanted to ensure that the South African musicians were being fairly compensated, not just by industry standards, but by his own personal ethical standards. My source tells me he went far beyond contractual obligations, setting up royalty structures that were revolutionary for the time. Between you and me, the true cost of Graceland wasn't measured in dollars or even in reputation. It was measured in Simon's mental health. The motivation that drove him to create this masterpiece came at a price few would be willing to pay. For months after the album's release, as accolades poured in, Simon reportedly struggled to enjoy any of it. The controversy had left him deeply skeptical of praise, questioning everyone's motives. What the world doesn't know is that Paul Simon's defiance didn't end with Graceland. My source revealed that Simon used his newfound leverage with his record label to quietly support other artists who wanted to break boundaries. He became an invisible godfather to musical risk-takers, offering both financial backing and strategic advice, always from the shadows, never taking credit. The truth finally exposed after all these years. Paul Simon wasn't just motivated by artistic curiosity or career rehabilitation when he made Graceland. According to those closest to him during that period, he was driven by something far more personal, a deep-seated fear of irrelevance. The motivation wasn't just to create something new. It was to matter again in a musical landscape that seemed to be leaving him behind. They don't want this getting out, but Simon's relationship with the album itself has been complicated. My industry source tells me that for years, Simon couldn't listen to Graceland without being transported back to the controversy and pain surrounding its creation. The very songs that revitalized his career became emotional triggers. Only recently has he been able to appreciate the album for what it is rather than what it cost him. Between you and me, the legacy of Graceland is still unfolding in ways that would shock most people. The album didn't just change world music, it changed how the music industry approaches cultural collaboration. But my source reveals that Simon himself has mixed feelings about this legacy. He's watched as other artists have followed his path, sometimes with greater sensitivity and awareness than he managed, and it's forced him to reconsider his own choices. What drove Paul Simon to risk it all wasn't just creative restlessness. It was an almost spiritual calling that he couldn't ignore even when everyone around him was telling him to stop. The motivation came from somewhere beyond rational career planning. As he told my source years later, sometimes the music chooses you, not the other way around. Now that you know the truth about Paul Simon and Graceland, here's what happens next. The story of Graceland isn't over. My industry sources tell me that previously unreleased recordings from those South African sessions still exist, material so culturally explosive that Simon has kept it locked away for decades. The motivation behind the secrecy. Some collaborations were with artists who were explicitly forbidden by the apartheid government from recording together due to tribal affiliations. Between you and me, Paul Simon is currently considering a final project that would revisit Graceland, not as a sequel or remaster, but as a complete recontextualization. The motivation driving him now, in the twilight of his career, is to finally tell the full story his way, without the constraints that limited him in the 1980s. What they don't want you to know is how deeply Graceland continues to influence music today. My source has identified at least 7 major albums released in the past year that draw direct inspiration from Simon's approach on Graceland, though few artists are willing to acknowledge this influence publicly, given the complicated legacy. The truth about motivation and defiance is that they come with a price. Paul Simon paid that price to create Graceland, and the music world was forever changed as a result. The question remains, what other artistic revolutions are being stifled right now because artists lack the courage Simon showed? If this inside story of risk, defiance, and ultimate vindication has resonated with you, you need to subscribe now. Because next week, I'm revealing the shocking truth behind another musical masterpiece that nearly destroyed its creator. Information so sensitive that the artist's estate has fought for decades to keep it buried. The motivation that drives true innovation isn't always pretty. Sometimes it's born of desperation. Sometimes it comes from defiance. But as Paul Simon proved with Graceland, sometimes you have to break the rules to change the game. What creative rules are you ready to break? Estimated duration: 9.6 minutes.